in addition to showing in other countries. Dr. Badawi is the author of numerous booklets and articles on Islam. He's married and has 5 children and 7 grandchildren. Dr. Morey is author of over 30 books, some of which have been translated into Spanish, French, German, Italian, Finnish, Turkish, Chinese, and other languages. He is the executive director of the Research and Education Foundation, which is dedicated to research and education concerning those topics which affect the future of Western thought and culture. Dr. Morey has earned degrees in philosophy, theology, and apologetics, and has been on hundreds of TV and radio programs. Dr. Morey is married with 2 children. Each speaker will be given 50 minutes on the topic, is Allah, according to the Quran, the true universal God. After the 50 minutes, then the other speaker will be given 10 minutes for a rebuttal, and then it will be the next speaker's turn with the same time allotment. Dr. Badawi.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. I greet you all with the greeting of all of the prophets, from Adam to Muhammad, peace be upon them all. A greeting in its most complete and perfect form. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which means may the peace, blessing, and mercy of Allah or God Almighty be with you all. I am very much happy to be with you today, and in that slide you have a very brief summary of the plan of presentation, Allah willing. First, I'll address some introductory remarks, mainly 2 questions. Why are we here? And some basic universal guidelines for any fruitful dialogue. And since the topic relates to Islam, a frame of reference might be also in order. Number 3, we'll turn to the term Allah, just try to find out exactly what it means. Fourthly, we'll deal with the issue of idol worship among pre-Islamic Arabs, and to show that it is perversion of monotheism that existed before. Fifthly, a few words about the myth of the moon god. 6, some discussion of the attributes of Allah, and a brief conclusion. If we begin with the first topic, why are we here? There are 6 basic points there. First, according to the Quran, all human beings belong to one family. In Surah 49 in the Quran, Allah addresses all mankind, not only Muslims, and it says, "O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female," so you have the same parents, "and we made you into nations and tribes that you may get to know one another. Lo, the most noble or righteous of you, or closer to God, is the one who is righteous indeed." In Surah 30 in the Quran also, it explains why there are so many complexions and languages, and it says, "Of the signs of God," means God's wisdom and mercy, "is the creation of heavens and earth, and the variations in your complexions and your languages." Secondly, we are living in an age where we have to accept pluralism. In fact, pluralism is a well-established Quranic principle. In the Quran we read, "If God willed, He would have made all people one nation." So you should compete in goodness, the Quran directs. No matter what kind of truth claims are made by the various followers of various world religions, ultimately we've got to learn to understand one another and to accept that pluralism, because God did not create us carbon copies. Number 3, in a nice day like today, nice sunny Saturday, and to see this large gathering here, it's very heartening. My guess, which I hope is correct, that the great majority of the audience, in addition of being brothers and sisters in humanity, they also share one important family, the Abrahamic family, that applies to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And in fact, all three communities believe that they belong to Abraham either physically and or spiritually, which is even more important than the physical descent. Fourthly, given the notion of pluralism and even the closer relationship between the members of the Abrahamic family, mutual understanding, which is regarded as important generally, is even much more needed between these three communities. That mutual understanding means also that we should all be persons who are trying to seek the truth wherever we may find it. And it's not only a matter of understanding, I am hopeful also that it would eventually lead also to better relationship with one another, free from misconceptions, generalizations which are not correct or true, or other polemical nature or type of material. The second question in the introduction that I'd like to address in the second slide are some basic issues when we get scholars to discuss comparative religion. There are things that we should all observe, and this is not a personal remark of anyone, it is general rules that I hope you all agree are reasonable. First, we should not fabricate. If something is not there in the scripture and we say the scriptures say that, that's a very serious problem. It is fabrication that doesn't exist. We shouldn't do that. That's a chit-chat. Number two, when we quote, the quote should be accurate, which means we do not take a quote from either scriptures and add our own words to it or change the word around that it might give a different meaning. Number three, we should also keep our quotation in proper context. Without that context, all you need to prove anything is only $2 and a hardware store, pair of scissors. You can go to any scripture, get the pair of scissors and cut any bits and pieces here and put it together. I bet you can believe you can prove anything under the sun. That is not the honest approach. We should not convert or refer to things changing words in such a way that it would give a misleading and out of context interpretation. Not only out of context of the text that we're quoting, but the totality of the scripture that we are referring to. Another issue that I hope you all agree to, we should not have misleading selectivity. There are many topics, many issues that are covered in both scriptures. And to leave 99% of what the scriptures say of one topic and get one particular one or two quotations, just keep bombarding people with them, I don't think this is the correct way of understanding. We have to take the totality of what the scripture deal in one particular issue or the other. Misrepresentation is a very serious problem as well. When things are presented with a twist, so that's what we call half-truth. Half-truth is not partial truth. Half-truths are falsehoods. When you take something and misrepresent it in a twisted manner, obviously that does not necessarily give an honest indication of what it is. And finally, if we have made either of us factual error, if I say the Bible say this and it's proven false or out of context or distorted quotation, I should be willing to stand up, to be big enough and say, I'm sorry, I misunderstood it or I misquoted it, even though sometimes when it's so clear, I might find it very difficult to explain myself. When it's so black and white and I misquote directly, it's very difficult, but in any case, the question of acceptance of correction should be there. Now, since the topic is about Allah as understood by Muslims, in the next slide we have just a brief remark about Islam, so that we put things again in the proper broader context that I mentioned. And here we find that there are basically three issues that I'd like to raise. One, that the term Islam itself, linguistically, comes from an Arabic root which means to achieve peace through submission to God. Both are root words, peace and submission. Peace with God, which is the basis, peace within oneself resulting from that, and peace with other beings, and we find both in the Quran and Hadith, the saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him, how to establish relationship with even animals, kindness to animals. There are Hadith about the use of resources, about plants and environment. And when we speak about submission to God, we speak about willing, loving, and trusting submission to God and acceptance of His wisdom, guidance. In terms of fundamental beliefs, to sum up very quickly, belief in Allah, or pure monotheistic faith, which is the topic for today. There is also the belief in revelation, that God revealed His will and His instructions and guidance to mankind through a series of prophets. These prophets are not enemies of one another, even though sometimes their followers become, but that's not the intent. They are like a brotherhood of emissaries of God to guide mankind. We believe that some of those prophets received revelation in a form of scriptures, and the Quran speaks about those. That will come later. Thirdly, in Islam, it is important to emphasize the individual accountability and the life hereafter, where there is reckoning of our life on this earth. With this brief introduction, let me get directly into the topic. And we begin with the term Allah. On that slide, you find a subdivision of what I intend to cover under this broader title. First, some of the Western references, especially those that Dr. Morey quotes in his Islamic invasion, which I'd like to call invasion of Islam, in fact. Western references. Secondly, I'm going to ask the question whether that term, Allah, is derived from the moon god. Thirdly, what term is used by Christian Arabs? Fourthly, to discuss whether fear and intimidation is the reason why Christian Arabs use the term Allah. Beginning with the first sub-area, we find that contrary to Dr. Morey's conclusions, I have 8 encyclopedias that I quoted that he also referred to, most of them, almost all of them he referred to. In Americana, it says Allah, this is the definition of the term as it appears under that title, means God, capital G, or more properly, the God, the sole unique divinity. Britannica indicate that Muslims of all nationalities accept the term Allah as the one true God. In Britannica, the 73 edition, it simply, this is the Arabic term for God, capital G. In Britannica, 87, the unique or wahid, inherently one, or ahad. In the following one, we have 4 additional references that Dr. Morey also refers to. God is the unique one, the creator, or Allah. Shorter Encyclopedia of Islam, the proper name of God. That's an additional point. The proper name of God among Muslims. Encyclopedia of Religion. It says Allah is presented in Islam as the proper name of God. Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, edited by James Hastings. The proper name of God among Muslims. Therefore, I conclude that contrary to Dr. Morey's conclusions and references that he used, actually, they speak about Allah, meaning the one true God, which is also the proper name for God. The second title, the question. Is the word Allah derived from the moon god? Or does it have anything to do with biblical language and biblical terms? Here in the 1910 edition of Britannica, it clearly says that it is compounded of al, the definitive article, and ilah, which means God. And notice here, the same word, this is the bold-faced one, the same word is found in Hebrew and Aramaic as well as Arabic. Britannica, 73. Contrary to the frequent claims made by Dr. Morey that Allah is not a biblical name. In fact, it says that the proper etymology is the contraction of Al-Ilah, the God, although Aramaic Alaha has been proposed. There is a brother here before the meeting who showed me a copy of the Aramaic Bible, and it has exactly the term Alaha. Encyclopedias are correct, at least in that respect. Britannica, 87. The origin of the name can be traced to early Semitic writings in which the word for God was L-I-L or L-E-L, the latter being the Old Testament synonym for Yahweh. Is it a biblical name then or not, or the origin of it? Next, Encyclopedia of Islam. Again, it says another suggestion of the origin of Allah is the Aramaic Allaha. For Islam, the name Allah is indeed, as MacDonald said, El, the proper name of God that's among the Hebrew people. Short Encyclopedia of Islam. It says Allah is of Aramaic Allaha, the God, again corresponding to Yahweh. Encyclopedia of Religion, 87. The origin of Al-Ilah is found in the roots common to various ancient Semitic language. That's Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic. Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics. Allah corresponding to the usage of Jehovah or Yahweh among the Hebrews. Next item. What kind of term has been used by the Christian Arabs for God? Britannica. Allah is the standard Arabic word for God used by the Arab Christians. Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics. In the current Arabic Bible, that's 62, in the current Arabic Bible versions, God is uniformly referred to as Allah. Kenneth Cragg, which has been quoted also by Dr. Morey, he said, since both Christians and Muslim faith believe in one supreme, sovereign, creator God, they are obviously referring, when they speak of him, under whatever name, to the same being. Now, Dr. Morey contends that the reason why the Arabic Bible used that term is the persecution of Islam, because Islam was dominant and there was no Bibles in Arabic prior to the 9th century. I got some physical evidence with me right here. Here is a copy of the Arabic New Testament published by the American press in Beirut, 1955. And remember, Beirut is in Lebanon, and Lebanon is half Muslim, approximately half Christian, and until very recently, the president has always been a Christian. Beirut, 1977, the term Allah in Arabic is used. Beirut, 1986, the term Allah is used. In Jerusalem, in 1977, a New Testament in Arabic is also printed using the term Allah. Remember that Jerusalem has been under Israeli occupation since 67. Finland, that's not a Muslim country, intimidated by Muslims, is it? Finland, printing an interpretive translation of the Injil, the Gospel, printed in 1974, using the term Allah. Colorado, United States, printed, but no date, using the term Allah. Minneapolis, Minnesota, 1991, using the term Allah. I don't know whether there could be any doubt about what is understood in Arabic by the term Allah. It is indeed very strange to say that Muslims forced Christians and Christian translators and clergy to use the term Allah and did not force them to change religion. Very strange indeed, let us alone the kind of respect that was shown to people to follow their own faith according to the dictates of the Quran. The next item. So Dr. Morey keeps saying that the term Allah was known before the Prophet came, and it is associated with paganism or with the moon god, as we'll show later. So as such, has nothing to do really with true monotheism. I think that reflects some misunderstanding. Misunderstanding about the nature of Arab beliefs and the existence of monotheism already in Arabia. According to Muslims, Prophet Abraham left his son Ishmael and his wife Hagar in Mecca. So there was monotheism already. There were procedures for pilgrimage even to commemorate certain events that took place in the life of Abraham and Ishmael. So monotheism was known. It is a big mistake to think that the pre-Islamic Arabs were idol worshippers in a sense that they believed that those idols indeed were the creators of heaven and earth. Here is a list of evidence from the Quran. If we move to the evidence from the Quran, which is so obvious and clear that the Arabs did believe in the one true universal God of all. Just to give you an example of this, if you ask them who has created the heavens and earth and subjected the sun and the moon, they will certainly reply, Allah. How are they then deluded away from the truth? If you ask them who sent the rain down, they will say Allah. Who created the heavens and earth? They will admit it is Allah. And the same you find throughout the Quran. Their problem really was not that they did not believe in the existence of the supreme God that they might have inherited through the Abrahamic family tree, through Ishmael. Their problem was to associate others with God and to believe that those idols can act as intermediaries between God and man. And that is shown actually in the following slide. Why did they worship idols then? The Quran answered that question clearly. لِيُقَرِّبُونَ إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفَى, so that they may bring us nearer to Allah. That's the mistake they did. They did not think that those idols indeed are gods as such. There are examples also from other sources that Dr. Morey keeps quoting. In the shorter Encyclopedia of Islam, it says there, the Meccans admit that Allah is creator and supreme provider. Now I move to another question, another sub-area. Did Islam indeed accept or just adapt this distorted view? Was Islam nothing more than an extension of these paganistic images about God? According to the Quran, absolutely no. But even to get to Western scholars, normally quoted by, some of them at least quoted by Dr. Morey in his writings, you go to Americana. It says when the Prophet Muhammad began to preach the pagan Arabs in the 7th century, the heart of his message lay in the declaration that Allah is the sole unique divinity. Notice here, sole unique divinity, not just another God or a higher God. Sole, la ilaha illallah. But the question here that you should raise, if Islam was nothing but an extension of the paganistic view of God, why did the pre-Islamic Arabs fiercely persecute the Prophet and kill his followers for a period of 13 years? They suffered all kinds of difficulties under them. If it's just an extension to their belief, unless it was totally radical from their polytheistic ideas, they would have not fought against the Prophet. There are other reasons, of course, for their opposition. At least in the matter of belief, there could be no reason for them to oppose. According to Britannica, it's clearly stated that Allah is the one and only God, or the notion of Allah as the one and only is the pivot of Muslim faith. In the following quotation from Britannica 87, Allah is creator, judge, and rewarder, omnipotent, and all-merciful. The question that I should raise here, which of these attributes, I ask my Jewish and Christian brethren here, which of these attributes would you say is non-biblical? And does it apply to the God you and I believe in? Encyclopedia of Islam. It says, but the vague notion of supreme but not sole divinity, which Allah seems to have connoted in the Meccan religion, notice here the bolded letters, was to become both universal and transcendental. It was to be turned by the Quranic teaching into affirmation of the living God, the exalted one. What kind of God do Jews and Christians believe in if he is not the living and exalted one? The next item, Encyclopedia of Islam. It says, hence, from the beginning, not something that he just tried to compromise, from the beginning of Muhammad's preaching, the affirmation of God, Allah, as benefactor, creator, bountiful, imparting instructions to men, imparting, should I say, to men through a messenger to whom he was in a special way the Lord. Question: what did Israelite prophets teach differently from this? 6. Shorter Encyclopedia of Islam. It says, but though the name Allah was the same for the Meccans and for Muhammad, notice this, their conceptions of the nature of the bearer of the name must have differed widely. Differed widely. That only makes sense. Otherwise, why did they oppose the Prophet and complain that he made all the gods one God and all this kind of objection to his teaching? Encyclopedia of Religion. It says certain types in the Hijaz, which is now in Saudi Arabia, also invoked him, means God, as is shown in the end of Surah 29. However, the same surah illustrates that Allah, the God of the Quranic teaching, has nothing in common. This is crucial. Nothing in common with any similarly named divinity. Anyone can take any good name of God, Allah or Jehovah or whatever, and you get a statue and say this is Yahweh. It doesn't mean that Yahweh is false or their attribution is false. Gib, quoted also by Dr. Morey, in that particular book, quoted I mean in other books of his, both the concept of a supreme God and the Arabian term Allah have been shown to be familiar to the Arabs in Muhammad's time. What Muhammad ﷺ did was to give a new and fuller content of the concept, to purify it from elements of polytheism which still clustered around it. The last quotation is indeed very interesting because it is also from an author, and I believe the same book also that Dr. Morey refers to in his writings to prove that Allah is nothing but a pagan god or a moon god. Here, verbatim what Alfred Gulam says, and I let you judge. Like the Old Testament prophets, Muhammad took steps to put an end to practices which were inconsistent with monotheism. The Quran condemns the heathen rites as a sacred stone, which it called uncleanliness and the work of Satan. It orders believers to have nothing to do with them and forbids Muslims to eat the meat of an animal which has been slain in such places. Now let us move to the next sub-area, the crescent. There was, I think, one Before that, let's say the crescent, an Islamic symbol. In his writing, Dr. Morey keeps saying that one of the evidences in his mind that Allah is nothing but the moon god, that he says that this appears on the flags of Muslim countries. First of all, that is not correct. Out of the 38 countries with majority Muslims, there is hardly 4 or 5 countries that has the crescent. The great majority do not. Number 2, even the birthplace of Islam, Saudi Arabia, their flag does not have a crescent. That would have been the most logical flag to have the crescent if there's any connection whatsoever with moon worship. Number 3, the fact that in Muslim countries today you find a lot of domes or minarets are topped with a crescent. It's a cultural practice. It was not done by the Prophet in his time or upon his instruction. And my guess, I could be wrong, that this is just a tradition so that the travelers would find which is a church and which is a mosque, because both have also minarets. So maybe they just put that as a distinction to attract people or to show that this is the place for the mosque, to distinguish as a place of worship. It's a later tradition. It's not a teaching in the Quran. It's not a teaching of the Prophet. Number 5, there is no Muslim that I know of who attach any significance whatsoever or belief to the question of the crescent god simply because the crescent has been used to distinguish buildings. 6, maybe one of the reasons that Muslims follow the lunar calendar, but Dr. Morey wants us to believe that this is a further evidence of worshipping the moon. But don't the Jews also use the lunar calendar? Do the Jews worship the crescent? Number 7, Christians also had some symbols, like the cross, like the fish. Does that mean that they worship the fish god? But now, let's leave all that aside and conclude that there is nothing called religious symbol in Islam. There is nothing called, it's a fiction to speak about a religious symbol in Islam. There is no symbolism in Islam. Even the flag at the time of the Prophet was just a small piece of cloth. That's all. It's no symbol, as we find the cross with its significance to the Christian, of course, becoming a symbol, or the Star of David for the Jews. We cannot equate the crescent with that. It's just tradition that grew up, has nothing to do, no connection with worship at all. But then what is more important, what does the Quran say about the moon? And I was really surprised reading Dr. Morey's book that he refers to the verse but doesn't really quote it in full or quote it at all even. And he says the Quran makes mention of the sun and the moon. Whereas if you really look at the verse that he's referring to, it says of his signs, of the signs of God's creation. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ اللَّيْلُ وَالنَّهَارُ وَالشَّمْسُ وَالْقَمَرُ لَا تَسْجُدُوا لِلشَّمْسِ وَلَا لِلْقَمَرِ وَاسْجُدُوا لِلَّهِ الَّذِي خَلَقَهُنَّ إِن كُنتُمْ إِيَّاهُ تَعْبُدُونَ. So crystal clear of the signs of God's creation, or signs of God is the creation of heavens and earth. And the sun and the moon prostrate not to the sun or the moon, but prostrate to the one who created them, if indeed him that you worship. The Quran clearly makes in number 2 clear that the sun and moon are not to be worshipped. They are subservient to us. سَخَّرَ لَكُمْ. Allah made it subservient for the use of mankind. I didn't hear of anyone who used his God as his subservient. Number 3, 26 verses in the Quran speak about the moon. Not one treats it other than a creation of Allah subjected to his will. Number 4, the sun and moon are created by Allah also, is mentioned in Bukhari. And here I'd like to humbly suggest to Dr. Morey to correct himself and be big enough to make that correction, because this is a factual misquotation. Dr. Morey in his book quotes or refers to 11 hadith in Bukhari to support his statement that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, reached up with his sword and cut the moon into half. Reached up with his sword, and then he mocks at Islam by saying that sword must be either very big or the moon is the size of the basketball. You have the volumes of Bukhari, Dr. Morey. I challenge you to show me in a single hadith of the 11 hadith that you quoted, where does it mention the word sword? It is nowhere to be found in the 11 hadith that you quoted. That requires correction. Nor does any of this hadith say that the Prophet split the moon. It says the moon was split ala ahdi Rasulillah, at the time of the Prophet, and the Prophet said, witness, as a sign. This is a factual correction that is needed. Some people might say, how about the concept of daughters of Allah? Oftentimes when I read Dr. Morey's works or hear his tapes, he seems to be giving a false impression that the daughters of Allah that the Arabs believed in are even mentioned in the Quran, leaving the reader with the misleading impression that the Quran mentioned the daughters of Allah by way of agreeing with them. This is not so, Dr. Morey. When you look carefully into the Quran where the word Banatullah, or daughters of Allah, وَيَجْعَلُونَ لِلَّهِ مَا يَصِفُونَ, they attribute to Allah females as his daughters and to themselves the sons. Not one of them, not one, agrees with this distorted notion. It ridicules the idea of God having daughters or sons for that matter. So the fact that the Quran mentioned some of the idols believed by some Arabs to be daughters of Allah, Allat and Uzza and Manat, is not an admission, it's condemnation, that this is wrong. In fact, there is a reference in the Quran in 7:180, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يُلْحِدُونَ فِي أَسْمَائِنَا لَا يَخْفَوْنَ عَلَيْنَا, that those who distort and profane our names, we know about them, Allah says in the Quran. And in fact, as some scholars suggested, that in a way of mockery, in mocking true monotheistic faith, some of those ignorant pre-Islamic Arabs, in their fanaticism, they tried to twist the word Allah into Allat, Al-Aziz, which means who is powerful, who has authority, into Al-Uzza, and Al-Mannan, the one who provides for mankind, into Manat. But nowhere, Dr. Morey, as you contend, there is any admission or acceptance or mention by way of acquiescence to this paganism. We move to the next one, the so-called moon god. And my question here, the moon god or the Bible or the God of the Bible? Dr. Morey keeps insisting consistently on something that I humbly believe to be extremely wrong and erroneous. That Muslims and Christians, or Muslims on one hand, Christians and Jews on the other, have absolutely nothing in common, that Allah is a pagan God, is a moon god, and all of this, it is not the God of the Bible. I refer you to Dr. Morey, to Alfred Gulam that you quote profusely in some places. Page 7. The oldest name for God used by the Semitic world, that means Allah. Pronounced El in ancient Babylonia, El in ancient Israel. Some scholars trace the name to the southern Arabian Ilah. But notice here what Dr. Gulam says. Ilah, a title, not name. Ilah, a title of the moon god in Arabia. Allah was known from Christian and Jewish sources as the one God. Later he says it is clear from Nabatean and other inscriptions that Allah meant that God. Here is an important notice here. The word ilah actually in Arabic means God, deity. But that's a title. It simply means God or Lord. It could be any. You can have many ilahs. The Quran sometimes uses this, that some people have gods, means false gods. So deities. It is different from Allah. So let's not make that mix. Let's not make that mix and be honest about it. Ilah is a title. The pagan can use, anyone can use. But when you use Allah, as we have seen with profuse evidence, does not equate with any God, just a high God or higher God or one of the gods, but as the one and only. Golem also does not speak of the name of the moon god, but title of the moon god. This is significant to keep in mind. Montgomery Watt says admittedly, this is a person who is really a scholar. I do not agree with many of his views. He's critical of Islam. But at least he's a scholar enough and honest enough and analytical enough to say the following. Admittedly, the average Muslim's cluster of ideas is different from the average Christian. Yes. But the correct way to express this is not by saying that the being denoted is different. Muslims must in intention be worshipping and speaking about the same being as Christians, even if their assertions about that being or about this being differ. Notice what he says after that. After all, there are Christian Arabs, Orthodox, Catholic and Protestant, and their only word for God is Allah. Their only word. There's nothing in the language but this to refer to the supreme God of all, which, like the Greek theos, I think there should have been a space here, means simply the God. Now I come to the final part, and I think we're doing all right with time, I hope. My stopwatch tell me 40 minutes. Yeah, it's 8 plus. Yeah, I have adjusted my divine attributes of God. I refer here to the chapter in Dr. Morey's book, in which he claims or try to make a contrast in 10 points at least between the God of the Bible, so-called, and the God of Islam. And I'm sorry to say, as a professor, that he gets 1 mark in one of them only. And I believe 1 out of 10 is not enough really to pass. So let me go through his assertions and rebut them. Number 1, Dr. Morey says that, by way of comparison, under the title, knowable versus unknowable, implying that the God of the Bible is knowable and Islam is not knowable, something like an abstract supreme being. Here, we find the full knowledge, first of all, of God's essence is impossible, and I think Jew, Christian, or Muslim alike would admit that. The real essence of God is above us. The Quran says there is nothing like him or comparable unto him. But does that mean that he is unknowable? No. God is knowable also through his attributes and the manifestations of his mercy, love, and wisdom. The notion of an abstract or distant God is totally alien to one who really understands Islam. In fact, at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a man came to him, simple Bedouin Arab. He said, is God, very innocent question, is God too close to have private, intimate prayer to him, or far away so that we have to shout on him? The answer came, and you find it in the Quran, was revealed to the Prophet. God speaks and says, when my servants ask you, O Muhammad, concerning me, then certainly I am near to them. I respond to anyone who calls on me. Let them, with a will, respond to my call and accept my guidance that they may be led aright. Secondly, Dr. Morey claims that God in Christianity or the God of the Bible is personal, in Islam is not. But again, here is something that a little bit of scholarship would resolve that apparent difficulty. There's no difficulty. First of all, in the Indo-European languages, the term personal or person actually means, in the theological sense, absolute perfections. And I give you the reference to that. I have a reference for it. Which is precisely what the Quran really teaches, as one Western writer indicated, Encyclopedia of Islam. But in the Arabic language, the equivalent of person is known as shakhs. In the Arabic language, the term has not undergone the transformation which it did in Indo-European languages. So when you ask a Muslim, he says, is Allah shakhs? He would say no, because shakhs in Arabic has only one meaning, a person, a human being, physical, limited being. Okay? Let's explain why. So in a sense, if we look beyond the superficial words, we find that the essence of God being personal and having relationship with mankind is quite clearly established in the Quran, and I give you some references to check on your own. Number 3, Dr. Morey said that spiritual versus non-spiritual, by way of contrast, the God of the Bible and the Quran. First of all, I must say it is wrong to say that God is a spirit. Angels are spirits, devils are spirits. This is a very limiting definition. I remember one Jewish rabbi saying that to try to define God in one particular word is to limit him, to limit the limitless. But it is equally wrong to say that God is non-spiritual, as the Quran speaks in relational terms and use that word spirit in relation to God. It says God created the human and breathed into him or her something of his spirit. How could we say that God is non-spiritual? Fourthly, Dr. Morey claims that in Islam, God is not even limited by his divine nature. Where did you get that from, Dr. Morey? If you mean by God is not limited, then you and I believe that God is omnipotent, if that's what we mean. But if it means self-limits to exclude traits and attributes that are not consistent with his divine glory, then you and I, not only you, believe in this. In the Quran, you read such statements like, كَتَبَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ الرَّحْمَةِ. Allah ordained on himself mercy. Not anybody imposed on him. You know, it's just like somebody says, can God create a stone that he cannot carry? The question itself is wrong, because God himself, not me, eliminated from his divine attributes things that are not befitting for him. Where is the difference? Number 5, Dr. Morey contrasts also the God of the Bible as trustworthy, but not so in the case of Islam. Again, I say, this is wrong. This is absolutely incorrect, and the Quran profusely speak about God, never. But that's a type, simply means Lord. The Quran use this, some people have fault. So they, yes, the Quran also speaks about the love of God. It calls him Wadud, that's full of loving kindness. It speaks about his mercy and forgiveness, the manifestation of his love in creation, guidance, and care for us, but also indicate that love is reciprocal. If we love God, we have to follow his path. 7, is God passive in history? Absolutely not. He is the sustainer. You open the Quran, the sustainer and nourisher of the universe. But we cannot say that the action of any human being are necessarily the actions of Allah. Allah is the sustainer. He is involved. Number 8, Dr. Morey says that the attributes, the so-called 99 names of Allah, are negative in nature. I have something for you, Dr. Morey, you might wish to look at. It's a real nice, I got it from Australia. Here is a little wheel, and if you put the names of Allah, can you tell me which of these 99 names that Dr. Morey claims to be all negative, which one is negative? I leave it to you. Number 8. 9. Dr. Morey makes the same mistake that many writers and speakers make about Islam, saying that salvation in Islam is by deeds, but in the case of Christianity or the Bible, in Christianity in particular, by grace. Who told you that? Dr. Morey, you claim you have read the 5,000 pages of Bukhari. Have you ever run through a hadith in which the Prophet says, none of you will enter paradise because of your deeds, righteous deeds? And he said, even me, had it not been for the grace and mercy of Allah. Now to come to the final conclusion. According to my watch, it's 48:22, but I respect I run my stopwatch, but I'm not going to argue about that. And thank you very much.
Morey would be given, according to the rules, 10 minutes for a rebuttal. And after that 10 minutes time, I will indicate that the 10 minutes are up, and he can then move in to his presentation. But 10 minutes is given.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
50, 50, and 10, 10.
Okay, so it's 50 and then 10. And 10, 10.
No, I agreed to 50 and 10, 50 and 10.
No, 50, 50.
I need to be public.
Sam is the one who's organized this. Sam, what was the organization?
Sam can come up because I was told I had 10 minutes. If he's afraid of my 10 minutes.
No.
I
Wait.
was told 50, 10, 50, 10. That's what you told me? That's the agreement. Yeah, but I did. But yeah, but he arranged it. Okay. That's fine.
Okay.
But it wasn't arranged, so I'll do my 10 minutes.
Sam?
No.
50, 50, 10, 10. That is according to the organizers.
Ooh, okay, all right.
We'll allow for a switch here, but then you will be given 50 minutes to... Right now, there will be given 50 minutes to Dr. Morey, and then 10 minutes first to Dr. Badawi,
And then me.
and then to Dr. Morey.
Fine.
Is that it?
Yes.
And the same in the second session. Okay.
Except I go.
Except
I go
Dr.
first.
Morey will go first in the second session.
Correct.
Okay.
And before we start the time clock, we'll make sure everyone has the paper. Is the Allah of the Quran the true universal God? Make sure you have that paper. And then we will begin when they tell us we are ready. I want to bring you greetings from the one true triune God of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and I do feel that I owe you an apology. I have been involved in many academic and professional dialogues. The first speaker is to give a positive proof or presentation of his position. Then the next speaker is to give his answer. Then it reverses, and the second speaker then gives his presentation, and then there's usually a 10-minute response. Dr. Badawi has chosen to make his first presentation a 50-minute response when he's never heard my lecture. I have never dialogued with him before, and as we shall see during my allotted time, he has committed, if you look on the paper, the typical logical fallacies, he has committed every one of those, particularly the last one, building straw man arguments. I have never said, I have never written that Muslims knowingly worship the moon god, or that the Quran teaches that we should worship the moon god. Given his 50-minute presentation, realize, number one, did he prove the existence of Allah? No. Did he demonstrate that the Allah of the Quran, not the Arabic Bible or some other Allah, Farrakhan or whoever it is, did he demonstrate that the Allah of the Quran was God? No. He assumed all of that, and whereas he had been allotted a 10-minute response to my presentation, he just did a 50-minute response, and unless you are the Mahdi and a great telepathist and of great mental powers, I do not see how you knew ahead of time what I'm going to present, because as you will see, ladies and gentlemen, what he has said in the majority of his statements have nothing to do whatsoever with my presentation. The second point that I do want to bring out is just to alleviate some of the concern. You will notice the little paper that was in ad hominem. Now, you must understand that ad hominem means when you cannot answer the person, you attack his character. And in that little paper, he misquotes, he does this and he does that, just so that some of you don't spend your time on irrelevant issues. Because remember, I could be the most wicked person that ever lived and still tell you the truth. So attacking me personally, which was done for 50 minutes, even though that was not the topic Allah, that was not the topic the Quran. He talked about Bob Morey and his book, Islamic Invasion. I feel a great compliment that you spent nearly 50 minutes on that. The one passage that came up in Toronto, there was a Muslim I was dialoguing with, and he spent a large amount of time on the color of Muhammad's penis. It was of some concern to him. And I said that in my copy of Bukhari, I was told that then his thigh was uncovered, the shift of his waist sheet, and I saw the whiteness of the thing. Now, does everyone see the word T-H-I-N-G? Does anyone see thigh? Does everyone who says this sees the word thing? Would you please raise your hand? Now, this gentleman went on and on and on that it did not say thing, it said thigh. Now, I did not haul the 9 volumes. This time I did, because these little tricks are red herrings to keep you from noticing that the topic, he was supposed to defend Allah, not defeat Morey. His purpose of coming down here was to stand up for the Quran and to prove to unbelievers it is the Word of God. Instead, he's attempted to say Bob Morey this, Bob Morey that, and I must apologize that I had hoped for better. Gleason Archer and the others had told me that they really did not think that Dr. Badawi would stoop to being rude, making these personal comments. With these few brief introductory remarks, we will begin with simply the issue that if someone walked up on the street and said, "Eat this," and you looked at this, you say, "Well, what is it? Where did it come from? Who baked it? What is, I got to find more about it." If someone went up to you and said, "Drink this," and they handed you a glass and say, "Drink it," would you drink it? No, you would have questions. And of course, when you buy a car, a salesman comes up and says, "Listen, buy this car." How many of you would buy the car without asking any questions? Is anybody foolish enough here? Maybe there's some car salesmen here who would like to meet you after the dialogue. Well, the issue is simply this: the art of asking questions is the very soul and substance of all scholarship and research. Asking questions and probing into things is the way you discover truth. Something is not true because you believe it. You should believe something if it is true. In order to find out whether or not, and I was given the title, is the Allah of the Quran the true universal God? I see it was changed and no one asked my approval. Is Allah according to the Quran? I realize the changing of the wording means a lot, because then it becomes a no-brainer. There is no debate on the first point. Is Allah according to the Quran the true universal God? Yes, I agree. Absolutely. Is Joseph Smith, according to the Mormon writings, the prophet of God? Yes. Is Krishna of the Hindus, according to the Hindu scriptures, deity? Yes. So that's a no-brainer. There's no debate on this. Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, agnostics, we all agree. The Quran puts forth a God and says this is the true universal God. But so does the Bible, so does the divine principle, so does all the other religious books. But the question that I initially prepared for is the Allah of the Quran, the true universal God. And in order to answer that question, we have to probe into the issue of the sources, the origins from which this Allah comes, not only from the Quran, but also the Quran itself. Now, I recognize that when you begin to ask questions, some people get a little nervous, because the Quran in Surah 5 warns us that if you ask questions, you may lose your faith, and that some people, by probing into the origins and sources, found out things they didn't want to know. Here we read in Surah 5, verses 1 101, 102, O ye who believe, ask not questions about things which, if made plain to you, may cause you trouble. Now, given the fact that we analyze all literature, regardless if it's the Quran or the Bible, in terms of syntax and grammar and context, it is clear that this first part says, if you investigate and ask questions, and we have to make plain to you certain answers, those answers will be troubling. Would you notice the questions are not the things which would trouble the believers, it's the answers, what was made plain. Now he goes on to put an exemption. He says, but if you're asking about things when the Quran is being revealed, they will be made plain to you. If you just want to ask, what does this mean in the Quran, fine. But if you're stepping back and you're questioning the Quran itself, you're questioning Allah and Muhammad and all of these things, that's a horse of a different color. That's why verse 102, he goes on to say, some people before you did ask such questions, and on that account lost their faith. There are people here today who were born in a Muslim home, raised in the religion of Islam, who began to ask questions, and when the answers were made plain to them, they lost their faith in Islam. This is why Mandudi, in his commentary, tries at the first part to shift the focus. I know the Muslim answer to that passage will say, well, he's only talking about questions that are useless and unnecessary. But you see, any question that is upon the heart of a listener is necessary. You should never say to your child, that's a stupid question. When I do a radio talk show, and I've had one coast to coast, some people would call and say, well, Dr. Bob, I think I have a stupid question. And I always say, no questions are stupid. You can get a stupid answer, but you should never put down asking questions. Well, here, at the end of his commentary, he goes on actually to say, do not try to probe into such things. And he gives a warning to Muslims, almost as if he's saying, don't ask and don't tell. Now, Bukhari tells us that Muhammad would often respond in anger when people asked him questions. Volume 1, number 92, the Prophet was asked about things which he did not like. And when the questioner insisted, the Prophet got angry. His cheeks would get red. And then he made a very fascinating statement. He said, Allah has hated you for asking too many questions. See, that'd be the first problem I have. Maybe because I was raised in the home of a skeptic. Maybe because of being a New Yorker or Westerner or whatever it is. But when anyone tells me, Allah hates you for asking too many questions, what kind of God is that? If there is a God, he would be a God of truth. Truth is never afraid of investigation. If you're really secure in your religion, you're not going to be afraid of questions. This is why I have to say right off the bat that when the Quran, you have Maududi, you have Bukhari, they begin to say that it's not good to probe into things. I realize that for some of you, this will be a difficult exercise because the very titles are questions. Is the Allah of the Quran the true universal God? That's a question. Is the Quran the Word of God? That's a question. We are questioning Islam. The focus of this dialogue, and the reason I drove all the way down here, was to discuss the credibility of the religion of Islam. That's why, even though there is the attempt to shift the topic, so I will speak to the credibility of Bob Morey, and you see, that'll take your mind off Allah. If you could be thinking about Bob Morey instead of Allah, well then, see, he can just slip Allah in while you're not looking. But we're going to ask questions, and I think it's important to do this. And as we pick up the Quran and we turn to Surah 25, we find that the people who lived in Muhammad's day questioned whether he was truly a prophet. They questioned whether or not the Quran was inspired, and they gave this accusation. The unbelievers say, this, referring to the Quran in the context, is nothing but a lie, which he has forged, and others have helped him do it. They're nothing but tales. One translation has myths of the ancients, which he has caused to be written, and they are dictated before him morning and evening. Now, the accusation of the people at that time was, number one, this is a pack of lies. Number two, it has multiple authors. Not only Muhammad was involved, but he had there's multiple authors. It's a book of fables and myths. Matter of fact, there's nothing new. The source of the Quran is not heaven, but earth. This was the accusation. Now, this means that the sources of the material found in the Quran, which would include the God Allah, was the main point of their accusation. How did the authors of the Quran answer this objection? Well, the passage goes on and says, in truth, it is they who have put forward an iniquity and a falsehood. The next verse, verse 6, say, the Quran was sent down by him who knows the mystery that is in the heavens. Now, I'm using Yusuf Ali's translation, and if you look, you will see that he has some footnotes. And in his footnotes, number 3058, he says, in their misguided arrogance, they say, we have heard such things before. Doesn't matter, we're talking about gods and stories and myths. They are pretty tales which have come down from ancient times. They are good for amusement, but who takes them seriously? End quote. Now, the answer, according to Yusuf Ali, is that the Quran teaches spiritual knowledge of what is ordinarily hidden from men's sight, and such knowledge can only come from God, to whom alone is known the mystery of the whole creation. You say, well, that's sort of a limp answer. Here, these people are saying the Quran is a rehash of previously existing materials. There's nothing new. There's no revelation going on here. We know all of this stuff from our pagan ancestors. Well, again, as we go to Maududi, his commentary, and if you read this, if you very carefully read this statement, apparently this is a weighty argument. Here's one of the great commentaries on the Quran. For there can be no greater proof of the fraud of prophethood than to specify its source. You see what Maududi's saying? If what Muhammad was preaching about Allah and all the rest of it that found its way into the Quran, if all of this stuff can be found that it is derived from previously existing earthly sources, the gig is up. He's not a prophet. And then he goes on to say, but it looks strange that no argument has been put forward to refute this charge except a mere denial, as if to say, your charge is an impudent lie. You are cruel and unjust to bring such a false charge against our messenger. For the Quran is the word of Allah, who knows all the secrets in the heavens and the earth. End quote. And then if you would underline this paragraph, the question of whether Islam derived its beliefs and ceremonies from heaven or from earth is crucial. If it obtained its God Allah, all of its religious rites running to Mecca, all of them involved in the pilgrimage, the fast, and its doctrines from previously existing pagan religions, then the claim that it was brought down from heaven falls to the ground. See, the people who were living at the time of Muhammad, they knew him. This is the boy that used to be with the camels. We all know him. They knew him. And their reaction, this is a forgery, this is a pack of lies, it's a bunch of stuff he's put together, other people have helped him, and it comes from previously existing material. It is not something that is brand new, never seen before, revealed. Now, how can we start in terms of our question? Well, number one, we have certain foundational principles. We can all agree, since we're talking about the Allah of the Quran. Now, this is a matter of, again, of logic. The Allah of the Quran is not the same thing as discussing the Allah of the Arabic Bible or the Coptic Church. to discuss those issues as Badawi did is called argumentum elence, irrelevant. We're talking about this book. Now, as I picked this book up, and I have read it and reread it for many, many years, I said, where can we all begin that both the Muslim, the Christian, the Jew, the Buddhist, the Hindu, the agnostic, the skeptic, everyone, we can all agree, number one, that we're dealing with literature. Does anyone here really feel that this is a song and not literature? It's a CD, a rap music? No. Number two, our interpretation of the Quran is subject to the same rules of analysis and exegesis that govern any literature. We've got to look at the grammar, the literary context of the paragraph and the passage. You have to also look at the historical and cultural context of this book. Now, I know there are those who say that it fell out of heaven complete. But there are those of us who say there's a historical and cultural context that is very earthly to this book. And this book cannot be explained except you go to Earth's history instead of trying to climb into heaven. Thirdly, one literary rule is that when a book refers to people, places, things, or gods which are nowhere explicitly defined in a book, it's because the author is assuming that the readers would already know about such things. I just sent off my 31st book to the publisher. Now, let's say in the book I referred to New York City. Now, did I give a map showing where New York City? Did I explain the Big Apple? Did I tell people it's a city on the East Coast? No, well, I'm assuming that when I say New York City, anyone who reads that book would know where New York City is. The same way with the Quran, it refers to many, many things, including Allah, which it is assumed that the listeners, the readers, already know about these things. Number 6, there are many passages in the Quran which would be unintelligible if we did not go to history. You can take, for example, the surah about the blind man. What's this about? What blind man? What's his name? What's the occasion? What's the big deal? Well, it was this blind beggar and this, that. You have to go to history. So how does Yusuf Ali introduce that surah? By going to the contemporary culture. The elephant. Why is a surah entitled The Elephant? Well, if you don't know a little bit of history and about the army and the elephants and the wars, and if you don't understand that, you don't understand what it's talking about. Don't have a clue. This is why Yusuf Ali and others give you footnotes. This is the Schofield Bible of the Islamic world. And you see the footnotes, sometimes there's more of them on the page than there are Quranic verses. Why? Because you have to do a lot of explaining, because the Quran cannot stand alone because it would be unintelligible. Number 7, this is why all scholars, I don't care if they're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or atheist, they all make recourse to history to explain things in the Quran. 8thly, what kind of literature is the Quran? We've said, well, it's literature. Well, what kind is it? Is it rational discourse? Are we reading something from Immanuel Kant here? No. We are told in Surah 12 and verse 3, we relate to you the most pretty stories and what we reveal to you in this Quran. If you took a pair of scissors and you went through the Quran and you cut all the stories out, stories about Abraham and Nimrod and all, if you cut all the stories out, you don't have much left, people. It is primarily composed of stories, pretty stories, beautiful stories, another translation. Now, we have a right to ask, where did these stories come from? Were they brought down from heaven? Something revealed they were eternally true on a table stone? Or were these old myths and legends that already existed before Muhammad was ever born? These are traditions and legends that Arabs, Jews, Persians, Christians, all of these things. Well, you see, the source of the stories become very important. Now, does it come as a great surprise to anyone who reads the Quran? It is filled with many, many stories which can be traced back, indeed, to various earthly legends, myths, and traditions. Now, if you look there on page 5, you find a partial list of what Yusuf Ali does. And just to show you how, I just gave you a few. If you look in Surah 2, I have down there verse 60, that as you look in the footnotes for these passages, I'll turn there, for example, Surah 2, and just reviewing my notes to make sure that I try to get my citations right. Now, sometimes I will be wrong, you will be wrong, we're all wrong, but that's not an ad hominem, that's not a moral problem, that's eyesight, typing 2 o'clock at night or something. Here in Surah 2, verse 60, where it says, therefore the 12 springs, and he goes and talks about a local tradition known by the Arabs and the Jews and on down the line. Then I notice, well, look, I missed some. There you go, later on, and you see you should write in verse 67 and verse 72. Once again, for example, here, this must have been a Jewish tradition about a whole fishing village in a seaside town which persisted in breaking the Sabbath and were turned into apes. And this is the monkey man story, where a whole village of people, you know, were turned into monkeys. Now, Darwin had monkeys to men, the Quran has men to monkeys. Now, what Yusuf Ali is saying is that this story can be found in these ancient legends. And this just gives you an example of how here's a Muslim who is unimpeachably sincere. As he goes through the Quran, the sources of the Quran are not heavenly but earthly, which is important. Now we begin our general questions with this introduction. Number one, and these are common sense. The first are just common sense. Is it possible to believe that you are worshiping the true God when you're actually worshiping a false God? Yes, of course. The Muslims turn to me and say, you're worshiping a false God, Dr. Morey. When you worship the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, you're worshiping a false God. You sincerely worship a false God, but you're wrong. And the Christian says, you are sincerely worshiping a false God. Dr. Badawi, Allah's a false God, that's all. But it is possible to be sincere and fervent and be wrong. Secondly, do most religions have sacred books which claim that the gods or goddesses revealed in their books are true? Yes. I mean, if someone came to you, hi, I'm here representing the religion of Halaban, and we believe in false gods, and we have false prophets and false scriptures, and I am going to ask you to join our religion. Would you like to have a false God today? Does any religion run around saying it has a false God? No, they all say we have true gods. Does merely claiming that you worship the true God prove that you are in fact worshiping the true God? No. You can claim anything you want. You can claim you're a tree plant, you know, planted in a pot. That don't prove anything. Is it possible that the Quran could be an error and thus Allah be a false God? Yes, it's possible. Does the Quran claim that Allah is the true God? Yes, it does. I've never said that it didn't. So when someone says, we're going to have a debate, a dialogue, we will discuss whether Allah, according to the Quran, is God, Dr. Morey will be saying, what? I agree. There's no debate on that. Everybody read it? Does the Quran claim that Allah is the true God? Morey's official answer, yes. I've always said that. Now, is it possible that Islam derived the name Allah from pre-Islamic sources? Yes, it is possible. It's possible that it got it from being a pagan god. Now, these are just simple, common sense questions that go across the board. A Christian has to face these. A Jew, everybody must face these things. Specific questions. Does the Quran define the word Allah? In most of its discussions, particularly as it relates to when the pagans are being addressed, no. And that's why you will see many citations from encyclopedias. And I'm glad you brought up these books because we will have fun looking at these books. The answer is the authors of the Quran assumed that the readers were already familiar with the word Allah, that it wasn't going to be something new. Was it shocking? Now, does the Quran assume that its readers had already heard? Yes. Should we look into pre-Islamic Arabian history to see who this Allah was before Muhammad? Yes. Again, the sources of the Quran must be traced historically back. According to Muslim traditions, was Muhammad born into a Christian family, a Christian tribe? Did he grow up in a home where he was told that God loved him, Jesus died for him, and he had assurance of salvation? No. He lived his life in fear. There was a strong wind. He got frightened if there was an eclipse. He was worried about the end of the world. If he went to the bathroom, he was afraid the spirits would come in through the holes in his body. And oh my, there's no evidence in the hadith to indicate to us that he knew anything about the wonderful story of redemption and how that God really loved him and Christ cared for him. Instead, he was not born into a Christian home. So whatever God he worshipped as a pagan, born in a pagan family, when he used the word Allah, he was not referring to the triune God of the Christians. If you were a Christian back in the 7th century, you believed in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The proof is the Quran denies the Trinity. Obviously, they understood Christians worship the Trinity, so they go ahead and deny it. So Muhammad did not believe for one moment that the Allah that he was worshiping was this Christian triune God. Now, was he born into a Jewish family? No, not at all. I'm one of those who do not believe that the Arabs are the descendants of Ishmael. Even in the book that one of the Muslims has written against me, he checked it out and he said it's true. In the pre-Islamic genealogies, Ishmael is never mentioned as the father of the Arab people. It is a fraud. So they're not part of Abraham's religion, Abraham's tribe. They're not part of Ishmael. They're not part of that biblical family at all. The roots can be found elsewhere, I give you that. Well, what religion was his family? Every Muslim scholar I've ever talked to said, well, he grew up in a pagan home. His father died a pagan. What was his name? Well, Abdullah. Ab was a slave or servant, and Allah. Now here we have a pagan man who has Allah, and he's a pagan. And he's the daddy. And he died a pagan. He died before Muhammad was called, so he couldn't have been a Muslim in that sense. Did Muhammad participate in the pagan ceremonies of Mecca? Of course he did. He went 7 times around the Kaaba. He went and did this, and he fasted, and he snorted water in and out, and shaved his head, and did all these things, which are the pagan ceremonies of. He did, of course he did. Matter of fact, what is a little disconcerting, and you will find Yusuf Ali puts us in a footnote, even after he renounced paganism, Muhammad continued to worship at the pagan temple with the 360 idols still there. And he commanded his followers, the command to go and to do the pilgrimage was said, according to Yusuf Ali, while Mecca was still a pagan center. So the Muslims were joining a crowd that was already circulating, worshiping the pagan religion of that time. Did the Arabs in pre-Islamic times worship 360 gods? Well, if we believe the hadith, yes it did. Now again, did the pagan Arabs particularly love moon worship? Were they part of the astral religion? Now Yusuf Ali, pages 16 through 19, through 1623, I give you the quotes, you look it up. He talks about the pagan religions during the time of Muhammad, and notice what he says. It will be noticed that the sun and the moon and the 5 planets, now if you count sun, moon, and 5 planets, what do you end up with? 7. How many times did they run around that Kaaba? 7. Many scholars say you must understand they were doing it for astrological reasons, the pagans, as they went around 1 time for the sun, 1 time for the moon, and 5 times for the planets, the stars. He goes on to say that the 5 planets got identified with a living deity, god or goddess, with the qualities of its own. Moon worship was equally popular in various forms. It may be noted that the moon was a male deity in ancient India. It was also a male deity in ancient Semitic religion. And the Arabic word for the word moon, gamar, is of the masculine gender. On the other hand, the Arabic word for the sun is of the feminine gender. The pagan Arabs evidently looked upon the sun as a goddess and the moon as a god. If Wad and Suva represented man and woman, they might well represent the astral worship of the moon and the sun as the man and the woman, the husband and the wife. The pagan deities best known in the Kaaba round about Mecca, Ralat, Uz, and Manat, we know them as the daughters of Allah. They were all female goddesses. Now, people say to me, Dr. Morey, you're mean, you're cruel, that you bring up the moon god when you're trying to explain this. Yusuf Ali brings up the moon god when he's explaining the Quran. That's why in footnote 5798 on page 1644, when the Quran swears by the moon, doesn't say by Allah, it says, yea, verily, by the moon, I get curious. Why are they swearing by the moon? Here's his footnote. The moon was worshipped as a deity in times of darkness, end quote. So, you will have to refute Yusuf Ali. You will have to refute all of the Muslim scholars who say, in order to understand this book, the Quran, you must look at the pagan religion surrounding it to understand what went on and why what is today. Next question. Did the Arabs build temples to the moon god in Arabia? Yes. All you have to do is trot over to the library. You can pick up Gertrude Thompson's book, or better yet, Wendell Phillips has a tremendous book, pictures of a huge moon temple. Now, did Arab tribes give the moon god different names/titles? Now, this is another logical fallacy that Dr. Badawi did. You cannot read back into ancient times fine linguistic distinctions made today. That's why one book will say Allah's a name, one encyclopedia, another encyclopedia will say it's a title. A name is a title and a title is a name. Sometimes authors use one word as opposed to the other for nothing more reason than simply they like it. So we're not going to fight over that issue. The thing is that the moon god was worshipped by the Arabs. They built huge temples. According to the sources, the most prominent deity in Arabia was the moon. Matter of fact, in Gesenius's Hebrew and Chaldee dictionary, lexicon, under his entry for the Hebrew word for moon, he refers to the Arabs as, quote, the children of the moon, end quote, because of their love of the moon god. So we know that they did it. The archaeologists, we have stone inscriptions, we have the temples, we've got the whole schmear. Now, what were some of the names and titles? Well, Sin. That's the wilderness of Sin, the Sinai. I think it's an appropriate joke of God that the major pagan god of the Arabs, the moon god, his name was Sin, and of course Christians know that sin is not something good. It's bad. And here is the wilderness of the moon god. And you have Sin, you also have Hubble. Hubble was predominantly sort of the personal name and the personal idol of the moon god. There's another one, Wendell Phillips brings up a huge temple and he found carved Elumqua. I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't pretend to know Arabic, so don't put me down for Arabic and I won't put you down for English. And whatever, how you pronounce it. And also you'll see many, many scholars say Ali-La was one of the names or titles because it simply meant the great god who was the moon god. Now you must remember, I'm a reporter. I do the best that I can to report to you what are in the scholarly reference works. Now, was the word Allah derived from Ali-La? And Dr. Badawi even read several citations which stated that. I give you some more, and the answer is that's the best guess. Allah came from Ali-La, meaning the God, not the one and only God, but the chief honcho, the big cheese, numero uno, the top of the pile. And it evolved to Allah. Now, was the pagan Allah a high God? Now, notice, underline the word a and the small g, because as you read these reference works, and I give you 39 citations, they'll often put the small g. And even when the Muslim will say, yeah, but here it says that Allah was the high God, they don't notice it has a small g. The author's trying to indicate to you it's a pagan deity. We're not talking about true God here. Was this pagan deity, who was a high God, worshipped at the Kaaba? Yes, he was. Was Allah only one of many Meccan deities? The answer is yes. Did they place a statue of the moon god Hubble? One reference work says on top of the Kaaba, another says inside, but there was a statue there. Yes, and they even describe it in your histories. I got the Book of Idols, found that at the Library of Congress, which goes, it's a famous Muslim work, going into all the idols that were worshipped by the Muslims, male and female statues, things of that nature. And the answer is yes. And at that time, was Hubble considered the moon god? Yes. Was the Kaaba the house of the moon god, and he was the chief deity, the one before whom they would even stand and pray using the word Allah? Well, according to these sources, that's what they're saying. Did the name Allah eventually replace that of Hubble as the name of the moon god? They dropped Hubble and just began to talk about Allah. It looks like that's what some of the Arabs were doing. Did they call the Kaaba the house of Allah? Yes, just as they had viewed it with being the house of Hubble, the moon god. Did the pagans develop religious rites in connection with the worship of their gods? Yes, they did. Did the pagans practice the pilgrimage? Did they go on pilgrimage to Mecca? Yes. Did they practice a fast? Yes. And when they got with the pilgrimage, did they run around the Kaaba 7 times? Yes. Did they kiss this black stone? Yes. Did they shave their heads? Do animal sacrifices? They run up and down these 2 hills. There was an idol here and an idol here. Matter of fact, when the Quran refers to running up and down, that Muslims must run up this hill and down that hill, it gives you the names, but it doesn't explain why they have to run up and down those 2 hills in reference to. The idols are gone. And again, I'm not saying that Muslims say, oh, I'm worshiping the moon god. No, they don't know that. Just as much as Christians, if they're dead wrong, think that we're worshiping an idol when we worship the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You can be sincerely wrong, but there's no reason to attack motives and character. Did the pagans throw stones at the devil? Did they snort water in and out of their nose? Did they pray several times a day toward Mecca? Did they give alms? Was Friday, as opposed to Saturday for the Jews, Sunday for the Christians, did the pagans choose Friday as their religious day? Yes. These were things that Muhammad grew up with. Come on, let's go, time to go. And off he would go, and he would participate in these things. Now, did Muhammad command his followers to participate in these pagan ceremonies while the pagans were still in control of Mecca? Now imagine, you've got a herd of pagans running around this building. The Muslims blended in with the pagans, and they ran around as one crowd. Well, yes, they did. Yusuf Ali, footnote 223, page 80. Now, were Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat called the daughters of Allah? Yes, they were. You even find this Yusuf Ali, footnote 5096, page 1445. There they're referred to as the daughters of God. Now, did the Quran at one point tell Muslims to worship or to view Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat as intercessories? I believe that it did. In Surah 53, 19 through 20. Were these verses later abrogated out of the present Quran? Yes. What are they called? They're called the satanic verses. So your great debater, Tabari, and then other writers simply refer to the satanic verses where Muhammad was in a situation in Mecca and he weakened, and the pagans were going to worship Allat, Al-Uzza, Manat, and he said, well, okay, they're great. And he basically tried to make up with them. Later, he said, Satan had put it into my mouth. We take it out. It's been abrogated. Now, Was the crescent moon an ancient pagan symbol of the moon god throughout the ancient world? Now, he didn't address himself to that because he'll have to admit that that's true. Everybody knows that. I'm in the process with a major publisher of doing a full-length, full-color of all the ancient moon idols and symbols of pre-Islamic, ancient, not only but in Turkey and on down the line. Were stars used as pagan symbols along with the crescent moon? And were these stars viewed as the daughters of Allah? Yes, they were. Do the Jews or the Christians of Arabia use the crescent moon with several stars next to it as symbols of their faith? No, they don't. Did Islam adopt the pagan symbol of the moon and the stars as its religious symbol? And I will correct that. A good man does. I will put down, you can correct that for me. I don't have a pencil. Do many, if not most, Muslims view the crescent moon, you know, the green crescent ambulances, and while you can point to a few flags that don't have it, I think probably there's more flags that do than don't, and sitting on top of all the mosques and stuff. But did it get adopted? Not by Jews, not by Christians. Any of you ever been in a Christian church with the crescent moon on top of the steeple? I don't think so. You find that in a mosque. Is it, as Islam developed over the centuries, did it adopt pagan names, pagan ceremonies, pagan temples, pagan on down the line? Yes, it did. It sort of assimilated them. As they would conquer a civilization, they would sort of assimilate it. Is it possible that most Muslims do not know the pagan sources of the symbols and rites of their own religion? Yes. Are they shocked to find out the true sources of their ceremonies and stories and even of their God? Yes. Can Islam be the religion of Abraham if it is derived from paganism? No. What then is Islam? Islam is an ancient fertility cult that has evolved and absorbed many different strains. It took a lot of the Talmudic stories, so there's a Jewish strain, there's Christian elements in it, there's Zoroastrian, there's many different things you can find in the Quran, and they're blend. Is the Allah of the Quran the Christian God of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? No. Do the Jews, I know many rabbis, I asked them and they said, no, we do not view that Allah is our God too. Then whose God is Allah? It's the God of Islam. Islam did not come from a Christian home, but from a pagan home. Now, these are simple questions. And again, let me clarify. I am not saying that the Quran says Allah's a moon god. So don't waste another 30 minutes on that point. I'm not saying that Muslims sincerely, knowingly worship the moon god. I don't believe that. I'm not saying that Muslims worship the daughters of Allah. There was a big shouting and they carried on in Toronto, and I kept saying, no, I'm not saying that. Would you please quiet down and listen? I'm saying before Muhammad was born. Now this means that we are dealing with pre-Islamic history. Has everyone got that straight? This means it is irrelevant as to what the word Allah may mean to you or to me today, November 9th, 1996. When you're trying to discern a historical question, you don't run over to Webster's dictionary. You don't, and for example, with the word Allah, Farrakhan says he's Allah. As a matter of fact, Elijah Muhammad, one of his books, says all black people are Allahs, and he put it in the plural. Now, obviously, the word Allah can be used in different senses, having different meanings for different people. In logic, we learn a very simple lesson. A formal fallacy is when you assume that just because someone uses the same word that you're using, they understand that word the same way that you understand it. So that as we begin to look at the resources, and I have given you the documentation which you can read, the following citations reveal that there's a general consensus among Islamic scholars that Allah was a pagan deity before Islam developed. He was only one God among a pantheon of 360 gods worshipped by the Arabs. Even if he was at that time viewed as a high god, this does not mean he was the only true God. And I was glad to see in one of the citations presented by Dr. Badawi, it simply means out of 360 pagan gods that he grew up with, Muhammad said, we're going to keep this one. All the others, you got to go. Get rid of his wife, get rid of his kids. All the others are shirk, it's idolatry. The one left is the pagan Allah that he grew up with, that his father's name was derived from. That was the god of the house of the Kaaba. So it began as a pagan deity, and it ended a pagan deity. Thus, I leave with this conclusion. Just because you believe in one God and someone else believes in one God, does that mean you have the same God? Or could you have different gods in view? Just as much if someone on Mount Olympus said, oh, there's Zeus and Athena, but I declare Zeus is the true God, universal God. All the other gods and goddesses got to go. Does that mean that Christians and Jews are worshiping Zeus? Just because this guy says this Greek God is the true No, no, no. I don't know how you're going to do in your 10 minutes to present your proof for Allah that he exists. You spent your 50 minutes responding to me. You didn't respond to the citations I have given everyone here. Well, we'll see what you can do, and I thank you very much.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, Dr. Morey says that I'm some type of prophet by saying something that he hasn't said already. Yes, I'm not a prophet, Dr. Morey, but I read your book and read your work. What do you expect me to wait until you make your presentation to make my first presentation? Yeah. Number one, I offered that format, but you didn't accept. Number two, you talked about me speaking about you, Dr. Morey. No, I'm not thinking about you personally. I'm talking about what I perceive to be your gross misunderstanding and the big questions about the scholarly nature of the material that you present to prove your point. Number three, you talk about this tie. Here is your own transparency. If you look just above, then the word thigh appears without any white paper or ink to make it pink instead of thigh. And here is my copy also of the same hadith, Dr. Morey. How could you have escaped? This is mine here, where the term thigh appeared twice. And if you look in Bukhari, you'll find the caption also is thigh, not thing, and even thing does not quote penis. So I think it's a serious matter of correct, honest quotation. Not personal, correct, academically honest scholarship. Furthermore, you brushed aside and you never responded, Dr. Morey, of the 11 hadiths that you said the Prophet held his sword and cut the moon into half. You brushed it aside. You never addressed it. These are two of the hadiths that you quote in your book. Can anyone tell me where is the word sword? Can anyone tell me where the Prophet says eyes? Or somebody say the Prophet split the moon? I have more, but that will be forthcoming later. Okay. Another point that you raised, that you say that as an evidence that Muslims worship the moon god is that God swears by the moon. If you have read the Quran so many times as you claim, Dr. Morey, you must have seen that Allah swears by many of his creatures. And the swearing of God is different from the swearing of the human. When the human swears, he swears by something greater than he is. But God has every right in Islamic theology to swear by any of his creatures. It is not the same kind of swearing. You would find in the Quran, Dr. Morey, God swears by the moon, by the sun, by nafs, by the soul that he created, by the night, by the day, and also fala wa rabbika, by your Lord. This is very much found in the Quran. It has absolutely no significance and no relevance to any paganistic notion whatsoever. Number one. Another point. You're basing a lot of argument about the so-called historical basis of what Muslim worship is. I challenge you, brotherly, Dr. Morey, to tell me where in any quotation were Muslims instructed to worship an idol. I challenge you before everyone. You made that statement earlier, unless you take it back. There is absolutely no place in the Quran or in the 9-volume hadith that you claim to have read that ever said to Muslims to worship any idol. In fact, the Quran from A to Z is nothing but condemnation of idols. And let me make another correction, Dr. Morey. It is true that the Arabs might have worshipped 360 idols, but for your information, Allah was not one of them. Allah was not one of those. This is a major error. It's a question of scholarship, not a question of personal attack. You're totally wrong and off track on that particular point. Furthermore, as I indicated earlier, I spoke plainly, I hope, but I don't know whether Dr. Morey was paying attention. I said the Arabs did not believe in these as gods. They believed in the one true God of all, but they simply believed that these are intercessors with God. So that was not intermediary. It's not, he took one and canceled 359. That is totally incorrect and out. Furthermore, you keep claiming, Dr. Morey, that Islam must have pagan origins because in Islam there is pilgrimage, there is fasting, there is circumambulation around the Kaaba and all of these. But apparently you choose your history and stop at the point that is convenient to you, Dr. Morey. Why don't you carry history to its logical conclusion, whether you believe or not that Ishmael settled in Arabia, but tell me where Ishmael and his children settled. You go to Sinai, they're not settled in Sinai. It is well known historically. Tradition goes back long before the birth of Prophet Muhammad that the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael. There's no question about that. There's no argument around it. If you can prove conclusively that this is not the case, I'll buy it, but you can't prove that conclusively. When you have traditions for centuries and somebody wants to rewrite history on his own and to his own liking, then which issues to accept? But all this fallacious argument, in fact, is based on one false assumption, that history stops at the pagans and Islam just continued those pagan practices. This is not so, and I did say that earlier also. I said earlier that monotheism was known to the Arabs through Abraham, through his son Ishmael, and their descendants. Monotheism was not new to them. The term Allah was not new to them. And you forgot to refer or comment even, Dr. Morey, in your whole 50-minute presentation about the quotation I got from Western authorities that Allah is coming from Aramaic. It is part of the Hebrew. It is the equivalent of Yahweh and Jehovah. How could you transform that all of a sudden into pagan God unless you also make the same claim or assertion for the Bible? Now, given the fact that the Islam or the monotheism started with Abraham, the riots that you see in Mecca today are not continuation of paganism, but restoration of the correct way of doing pilgrimage. These were practices that were done by Ishmael, by Abraham, and it was perverted by the Arabs. Islam did not come to imitate them, but to restore the correct way of pilgrimage. In fact, this responds to your question about Ishmael being settled in Arabia. Why do Muslims run between the two hillocks of Safa and Marwa? If you've read enough in Hadith, you would know, Dr. Morey, that this simulates the running of Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, between the two hills in search for water. If you say why Muslims drank from the well of Zamzam, because that was the well that miraculously gushed with water and the crying baby Ishmael. If you ask why Muslims go around the Kaaba, it is because it is the first house on earth built by Abraham to worship the one true God. The fact that the Arabs put statues is Muslims wanted to assert the right until it was restored and cleansed, but not to worship the idols. It was the restoration of the same kind of circumambulation. If you're asking why do Muslims throw stones in the procedures of pilgrimage, then if you studied enough, Dr. Morey, before writing books like this, you would know that these are the three places where Satan appeared to Abraham to dissuade him from sacrificing his son Ishmael, and Abraham threw the stones at him. So it symbolizes victory over satanic temptation. If you're asking why Muslims continue the practice of sacrificing animals, it is not because they imitated the pagan Arabs, but because this simulates the willingness of Abraham to sacrifice his only beloved son at that time, because Isaac was not even born at Mina. So all of the evidence that you're presenting, Dr. Morey, goes back against you, because it does prove that this has connection with the story of Hagar and Ishmael. And then you raised another issue to say that the Prophet hated questions, and the Quran say that you should not ask questions. Again, Dr. Morey, I'm sorry to say that you're quoting totally out of context. Don't take anything that Dr. Morey or I say for granted. Go and check it. And quite frankly, with the track record that I have seen of Dr. Morey's quotation, I would have tons of salt for any quotation or reference that you make unless I go and check it, and I did discover dozens of this kind of distortion. Let me be very frank and open on this issue. If you go to the ayah and read it from the beginning, لا تسألوا عن أشياء إن تبد لكم تسؤكم وإن تسألوا عنها حين ينزل القرآن لكم تبد لكم عفى الله عنها. The context of this ayah is that some people kept coming at the Prophet asking very little detailed thing about what is permissible or not. The Prophet wanted to tell them that, look, don't keep asking what is permissible. If Allah has forbade certain animals like pig meat or whatever, that's it. Don't keep and come ask me, can I eat hamburger? Is pizza all right? Don't keep asking this. And أصبحوا بها كافرين. It's not like you say, Dr. Morey, because you don't understand Arabic and the language of the Quran. Kafirin here not lost their faith. This is a mistranslation. Even if a Muslim makes that translation. Kufr in Arabic means actually rejection. That means some people in the past, means the Israelites, kept asking about certain things, but when they were told to do it, they did not do it. So it has absolutely no relevance whatsoever to the kind of conclusion that you're arriving at, Dr. Morey. The same thing when the Prophet was asked questions. You added your own words. That is not what the text of the hadith, and I've read the hadith that you're referring to. I'm not speaking from vacuum, Dr. Morey. I have the 9 volumes also as well. It doesn't say that. It says that some people kept asking the Prophet for so many details. And in one instance even, in another hadith, it says one person came and asked him, who is my father? He answered him. Another said, but who is my father? The Prophet got angry, not because he was asking about his prophethood or qualities, but suppose that man was a illegitimate child. What benefit to keep asking? This happened in the days of Jahiliyyah, that's before Islam, so why keep dwelling on this? I'd like to conclude actually by saying I didn't hear anything really that Dr. Morey has said that really make any rebuttal, and I must say that this issue of the moon split is not an eyesight or copying something 2 o'clock in the morning because you added something simply which is not there. You quoted 11 hadith, none of which mentioned that. It is not a mistake of an eyesight for sure.
Okay, now it's time for rebuttal by Dr. Morey.
When you're ready. You will once again notice that the topic was Bob Morey, not Allah, not the Quran, which is argumenta malinche. Let me just point out, because up in Toronto they had a penis fixation as well. He circled the word thigh. Keep reading. Do you find the word thing? Raise your hand if you see the word thing. Raise your hand. The whiteness of the what? The thing. Now, up in Toronto, Dr. Morey's a liar. It does not say thing, it says thigh. And he put only the first part. Who is common whom? I saw the whiteness of the thing. Now, I said, look, I don't pretend to know Arabic. All I know is that's what the Muslims did in their translation. I've got the book over here. I will give you $100 if you look right in Bukhari. If it doesn't say thing, I will give you $100. No, my copy's right there. It's green. Muhammad Khan, Lahore. All I'm saying is this. They made a big whoop-a-doo, and it means nothing. If you take your common logical fallacies made by Muslims, you have heard tonight all 10 of them. Number one, the fallacy of false assumption. Badawi assumes what he has yet to prove, that the Quran is the word of God and that Allah's God. He has yet to prove that. Secondly, he argues in a circle. He proved Allah by the Quran, and then he proves the Quran by Allah. I can prove my dog is a prophet by that method. When you argue in a circle, it's like rowing with one oar. It means nothing. You can't prove Muhammad by the Quran and then the Quran by Muhammad. You can't prove Islam by the Quran and then the Quran by Islam. There's also the false analogy that is used, and he would try to compare Christianity and Islam, the God of Christians, the God of Islam. This is a false analogy. Number four, the fallacy of irrelevance. The Allah of the Quran is the subject of the dialogue, not the Allah of Arabic-speaking Christians, not this or that issue. There is a formal fallacy that's involved, the use of the term. We also have the Christians who use the symbol of the cross. That is irrelevant to the issue. I have never said that Muslims worship the crescent moon. That's another false argument. When Muslims attack the character and motives of anyone who criticizes Islam, they're using irrelevant arguments. The character of the person is no indication of whether he's telling you the truth. This thing with the thing and the thigh and the penis and all of that is simply a smokescreen so you people don't see what's going on. The issue is Allah and the Quran, not the color or the size of Muhammad's penis. Also, if you continue to look, the present meaning of a word, page 4, irrelevant. The present meaning of a word is irrelevant to what it meant in ancient times. I don't care how many dictionaries you bring up that tell me what the word means now. We're talking archaeology. We're talking before Muhammad. There's the fallacy of equivocation. We do not share the same understanding of God, Jesus, revelation, inspiration, prophet, miracle. All of those things are totally different. My God is not your God. Your Jesus is another Jesus. The New Testament says if anyone says that Jesus is not the Son of God, he's Antichrist. So Muhammad is Antichrist according to 1 John chapter 2. The same thing when you think that the word Allah has only one meaning, that's a fallacy. It has many different meanings, and I illustrate it. There's also, number 7, the fallacy of confusing questions of fact with questions of relevance. I have demonstrated, and the sources will prove, that Muhammad grew up in a pagan home worshiping a pagan deity who was called Allah. Now, that they worship the moon god is also clear. As to whether or not it's relevant, and this is a question of fact, he said that I had no right to bring up the moon god. Now, this is Yusuf Ali. Here it is, Surah 74:32. Here's his footnote. The moon, next after the sun, is the most striking luminary to our sight. Its reflected light has for us even a greater mystery than the direct light of the sun, which looks to us like pure fire. The moon was worshipped as a deity in times of darkness. So no, I'm not crazy for bringing up the moon god in order to explain the Quran. You find this in your Schofield kind of reference work. You also have red herring arguments, number 9. When a Muslim is asked to defend the Quran, if he turns around and attacks the reliability of Bob Morey and his books, the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the Crusade, he's really introducing irrelevant issues, has no bearing. This is the key. He is assuming that if he can refute poor old Bob Morey, and I'm not Billy Graham. Some of you know Billy Graham. I ain't Billy Graham. This means he can refute me one side up and another, but does that prove that Allah's God? No. Does it even prove that my arguments are invalid? No. All it proves is a personal vendetta, which is a logical fallacy. The Quran does not win by default. This is why they usually attack the Trinity, the deity, and they think, well, Islam wins. Islam. No, you've got to prove your own book and your own God. Number 10, straw man arguments. You put a false argument into the mouth of your opponent, then proceed to knock it down. That's mainly what you heard tonight, straw man arguments. You also heard taking me out of context, which another did up in Canada. When I quote a source to prove that the word Allah was a religious term used by the pagans before Muhammad was born, and I quote, let's say, the Encyclopedia Britannica to prove that at this time, that's how it was used, then the guy comes up and says, ah, yes, but the same article talking about today says it means star. That's a chronological fallacy. I'm quoting an article that in the section of pre-Islamic Arabia talks about the pagan god Allah, and then he's quoting about the modern usage as a generic term, and what a generic term means, like the English word God. If I had a box up here, we put the word God, it's empty. You can put anything you want. Some people worship their grandmother, their uncle, the moon, the stars, dogs, Farrakhan. I don't care who it is. You can put anything in there you want because the word means nothing. Generic term means the word is like a rubber band. It can go anything. If you believe the word Allah is a generic term, fine. I have no problem, as I stated in Toronto. If you can say the Nation of Islam can refer and say Wallace Fard is Allah, Elijah Muhammad's Allah, Farrakhan's Allah, all black people are Allahs. If you have no problem with that, then fine. It's a generic term and it means nothing. And I don't object to empty terms that signify nothing. I have yet to see in your 50-minute presentation, you could not defend Allah, you could not defend the Quran, you did not prove the existence of your God. I saw nothing but ranting and raving against me, which is another logical fallacy, bringing in issues like the cross and stuff which are totally irrelevant. And as a professor like you, I have taught logic, and just like you graded me, I would have to give you an F in terms of making every logical fallacy known according to the textbook. So that in the last, if you look on page 10, second quote, Muhammad did not find it necessary to introduce an altogether novel deity, but contented himself with ridding the heathen Allah of his companion, subjecting him to a kind of dogmatic purification. Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics. Further down, third from the bottom, Allah was known to the pre-Islamic Arabs. He was one of the Meccan deities. Now, Dr. Badawi said he was not one of the Meccan deities. Well, you disagree with the Encyclopedia of Islam edited by Gibb. That's fine. I have no problem. Or you can turn over to page 11. Here again, we have many of these things. Oh, well, up at the top, the source of this Allah goes back to pre-Islamic times. Allah is not a common name, meaning God or a God, and the Muslim must use another word or form if he wishes to indicate any other than his own peculiar deity. Or down at the bottom, the customs of heathenism have left an indelible mark on Islam, notably in the rites of the pilgrimage, on which more will be said later, so that this reason alone, something ought to be said about the chief characteristics of Arabian paganism. The relation of this name, and he goes on to say Allah, which is a compound of the indefinite article ilah. Some scholars trace the name to the South Arabian ilah, a title of the moon god. Read it, folks. It's there. Thank you very much.
Okay. 3:30 or 3:40? Okay, we will reconvene at 3:40.